This screencast is designed to help students studying texts at IGCSE, Key Stage 4 level, approach a setting question in an exam. The children that I'm teaching are currently working on Much Ado About Nothing and To Kill a Mockingbird for the EdXL IGCSE. Therefore, I've used these texts in this screencast as my focus for the work. It is, however, totally applicable to a range of other texts, and I hope that you get a lot of benefit from using it. We are looking particularly at essentially two types of question in the GCSE. The two types of question which are commonly set in most examination boards being a straightforward explore the different settings of, whatever it might be, within a text, and maybe exploring setting as relevant to a specific character or theme, range of characters, if you like. And that is a question which has often appeared. And it's also an area which it seems to me that very often students are not comfortable answering. They're very comfortable writing about character. They're very comfortable often writing about theme itself, but the idea that setting might be used as a link between the two is something that perhaps they do find more difficult to grasp. Generally, when I'm approaching setting, I ask my students to consider what setting actually means. And I have essentially 4, 5 ideas as far as this is concerned. I say 4 or 5 because, as you can see, they sort of overlap. Time is a concept, but there is very definitely the era, what I call time era, the historical moment in time in which a novel or a play is set, and then time as in, on a smaller scale, the time of day, the interaction between night and day, and so on. Location is obviously setting. Children are very quick to pick that up. But also we should be looking at what we might call the socio-cultural location of the text. What is it that is specific? We know that To Kill a Mockingbird is set in Macomb, and we know that Macomb is in Alabama, and we know that Alabama is in the southern portion of the United States, and all these things. But what is this socio-cultural setup in that setting? This is This is a novel that is set a mere 60 years after the Civil War. It's a novel that is set 30 years or so before the human rights marches of the 50s and 60s. It is a state very proud of its links with the Confederacy and very scathing about North Alabama that fought with the Union during the Civil War. And so we know that we're in a world dominated by racial bigotry, dominated by attitudes that it then doesn't surprise us if we find coming out within the novel itself. Beyond that, as a final element, there are what I would call mini settings, that is to say the locations, the precise locations within the town. Maybe the precise weather conditions on a certain day, maybe precise buildings, precise rooms within buildings, and so on. And I would then ask children to begin to consider the significant settings in either of their texts. And on the slide in front of you now, while I talk, you can see a list of the ideas that I would hope people have come up with. You could pause the presentation now, have a look at this, jot it down, start to add your own to these lists. They're not in any way intended to be complete necessarily, but they are intended to help students recognise just how many individual settings there might be in a text that might require consideration. So pause, start to think for yourselves. Particularly here you'll see I've not really mentioned anything about weather conditions. I've not really mentioned anything, for example, in Mockingbird about the seasons and the way the seasons pass through the story. Most important. So pause now and rejoin me when you're ready. So, if you're back now, we'll move on and we'll start to think about how setting and character might link in a text like To Kill a Mockingbird. And I'm taking here as two or three examples, again, two of the Ewells and Tom. And we begin to realise that setting defines our characters. Bob is unemployed, but he has no hope of employment. This is, after all, the recession. He gets some state aid money, but he drinks it. He's a single parent. He's described by the whites in the town as white trash. It's not as though this is people who are not of his circle, if you like, being rude. That's how he is described. He's lazy and he's dishonest. Much of that can be traced back down to the setting, to the conditions under which he's living. His daughter, Mayella, obviously is also poor. She's a surrogate mother figure because she's the eldest daughter of a single father. She is an abused child. The nature of the abuse is certainly hinted at when Atticus introduces the idea of her kissing Tom not being like kissing her father, but we have no further discussion of it beyond the fact that she has a large number of children to look after. Nobody's quite sure how many there are. We don't know when Mrs. Ewell died or left or whatever happened. There may even therefore be a worry in the back of our minds that some of these children might be Bob's, but that's something that the novel, written when it was in the 50s and 60s, doesn't explore in depth. I have a feeling had it been written 40 years later it would do. But also with Mayella, she's white. And therefore, because of the setting of the novel, she can't actually lose. Because everything is stacked so heavily in her favour that she is going to win. Because Tom, who is black, cannot win in the context of the 1930s in a courtroom in the southern states of the USA. Even though he has a jury, even though the judge is scrupulously keen to ensure that this trial is fair, Tom, poor, honest, hard-working, cannot win, and the setting defines that for him. He's defined, therefore, by his colour within the setting. If we start to look at the way the town, as opposed to the state, is considered in the text, we begin to see ideas to do with the actual location appearing. Maycomb is an old and tired town. The courthouse roof sagged, as though somehow it's bowing under the weight of the needs to try and keep the law upheld, or maybe it's just given up. You need to find, and you will find, other examples in the text where the setting, as in location, affects the depiction of character or events that take place. So again, you could either pause now and do some work and come back, or listen to the whole presentation and then go off and undertake these tasks for yourselves. Other settings that you might want to consider, and again, I don't believe that my job is to do all these for you. I've never believed in that as a teacher. I want people to think about these things. Might be to consider the setting for one or two of the specific moments within the text. The interiors. You might look at the Dubose house, and then you've got these questions to answer. Why is there such a careful attempt to recreate a Gothic horror story in here? This is the moment, of course, where Jem is going to finally learn his biggest lesson before the trial about what courage actually is. And the Dubose house seems to be a living embodiment of all his heavily Gothic imagination from earlier in the text. You then might want to consider whether this atmosphere that's created in the setting adds to the effect of what is in essence a lesson in bravery. And also whether the physical setting of Mrs. Dubose's bedroom, how that relates to the description of her herself. There's a very detailed description of her facial features. The wet, as Lee calls it, that dribbles down her chin. Her difficulty breathing. Within this room that is redolent of all those great 19th century Gothic texts, whether it be Frankenstein or Dracula or whatever. Why is that? Lee has done this deliberately, and your job might be to think about why that would be. In terms of other settings, we might want to look at the settings of the Radley and the Ewell place together. And again, I've here highlighted sections in the text to help you do this. Atticus in the trial is very, very keen to establish a setting for the Ewell household. It seems irrelevant to the trial, Scout is slightly confused by it, but she realises what he's doing later. And again, you should start to make a table now at the elements he introduces and the reason for doing it. This will range, of course, from the proximity to the dump, the lack of glass in the windows, to Maella's pathetic and wonderfully endearing attempts to beautify, almost trying to recreate Miss Maudie's garden in her own rather pathetic little geraniums. This is one of these little symbols that Maella is not an evil character. She's a character who would love to do good, but actually probably has no idea how to do so. When we look at the Radley household, again, we have a similar idea, and here I've split the page references for you. And again, when you pause and do this in a moment, try to use this sensibly. The description of the Radley household at the beginning of the novel and the Radley household at the end of the novel are very different. Why? Because Scout has grown up. And the description at the end, of course, is Scout with a much more mature head, considering what their behaviour in the early part of the novel must have been like for Boo Radley. She sees everything in a different way. Atticus has told her to walk around in somebody else's shoes, and here she is standing on the porch, looking out at the world and recognising what she sees. It's a far cry from the description at the beginning of the book. Pause now and work on this for a while. Then rejoin if that's what you want to do. If you're working on Much Ado About Nothing, again, you might want to consider this. One of the tracks that I think is quite interesting to play with in most Shakespeare plays is Day and Night. Remember that Shakespeare plays were originally performed outdoors. They were performed in daylight because without electric lighting outdoors, it really wasn't practical to perform in the evening until the first enclosed theatres were built in the beginning of the 17th century for Shakespeare's later plays. And we can begin to plot what time of day certain scenes take place in. We look at Act 1, Scene 1, it's broad daylight and everything's open. There's no deceit going on really. It's open, friendly, pleasant and all the rest of it. But 2-1, the masked ball, takes place after what's called the Great Supper, so it must be the night time. So not only is everybody masked, which is of course intrigue, but also if we believe this, and it has a suspension of disbelief on stage, it's dark. So even then you can't see who everybody is. It allows for furtive listenings and overhearings. It is a time of mystery. The trickery of Act 2, Scene 3 and Act 3, Scene 1 takes place in the day, possibly suggesting that that trickery is light-hearted, compared with the trickery in Act 3, Scene 2, where John plots to present his fictional lovemaking, and that takes place in the evening. Still at Night, 3-3, has to take place after midnight, because Borachio is boasting about what he's set up with Margaret. Very, very definitely the right time of day for deceit, mischief, and misbehaviour. The wedding, broad daylight, everything's in the open. Two things. Everything's in the open, so all the deceits are brought out into the open. But the other thing about being in the open is that it possibly is a reason that the friar is able to note what has taken place. Claudio's lowest moment in the play, in his darkest grief, of course, takes place at night, at the tomb, before the play ends at daytime with a happy ending. We can see that there's a pattern between day and night throughout the play, just as there might be a pattern between indoor and outdoor in terms of secrecy and establishing what's going on. John's chambers for the plotting in 1-3 somehow add a layer to his intrigue. The humour of 2-3 and 3-1, broad daylight, out of doors, of watching Benedick and Beatrice having to manufacture places to hide, of course allows for what is a comedy to actually be funny. What we might want to consider about the location for 2-3 and 3-1 is where it is. Both Beatrice and Benedick are gulled, tricked, in the orchard. It's obviously a very big orchard, but we might want to consider what the significance of the orchard is. This is a garden with fruit trees. Sounds a little bit like a representation of the Garden of Eden. And what do we know of the Garden of Eden? It's an earthly paradise, but it's an earthly paradise with a serpent in it. a serpent that will lie and cheat and be a tricker. A very suitable place for the tricking of Beatrice and Benedict. Looking back at the wider timescale, just as we did with Mockingbird, of course, there are all sorts of requirements for the 16th century. Women are required to be modest, and so we'll look at Hero and Beatrice in that regard. There was a very powerful queen on the throne, again reflecting Beatrice maybe. There is a very strict hierarchy at this time in terms of what rank you were in society, and this is reflected in the play. You only have to look at the obsequiousness of Leonato towards Pedro to see how this works. But by the end of the play, it seems that Shakespeare has somewhat challenged it. Not only that, but in the true best traditions of comedy, the plot is uncovered by the lower classes, and it's the upper classes that are made to look silly. But also, because the plot is derived from a Roman comedy, Claudio and Hero are types. They have to behave in a certain manner. There is another post about this on the blog if you wish to listen to it. But they have to behave in a certain manner so that a happy ending can be achieved. They're not free to do what they want, and that is again a function of the time in relation to the nature of the play that we are watching. Now, I don't know what texts you're studying, but you can apply this sort of approach to almost any text, whether it's Mice and Men, Macbeth, King of the Castle, the list is endless. This idea of considering setting in its widest form, from the large geographical right down to the specific room in which something takes place, from the time of day through to the season of the year and everything in between, should be part of your regular thought process about any text you're reading. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it, and I wish you the very best of luck in any exams for which you are preparing at the moment. Thank you.